Okay, hi everybody, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor. Welcome so much to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm the President and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today. You may notice that there are more lights and more cameras here than usual, so our special guest is C-SPAN today. I just wanted to, again, thank you all. It's because of people becoming memberships and because of your support that we're able to put on programs like this. We're very excited today. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements about upcoming programs. So on May 17th, Tamas at 12 o'clock will be having a program called Hollywood Comes to East Tennessee. And on May 31st, we'll be having another brown bag lecture by Dr. Nancy Locklin Sofer, I'm ruining her name, called The Night Marauder, about East Tennessee's serial killer in the early 1920s. So today's sort of an interesting one. I have been asked to allow for someone to deliver the introduction instead of myself, so I'm more than happy to turn over to the library's own Assistant Director for Historical Services, Adam Alfrey, who will be delivering our introduction today for our speaker. But before that, I just want to say that our speaker was just published an article based on this talk in the Journal of East Tennessee History. And if you're not a member, you should become a member because then you can get this. And also, Adam's work appears in the Journal of East Tennessee History this month. So if you're not a member, sign up and we can get you a copy right now. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Warren. It is truly an honor to introduce our speaker today. He was born in the Bluegrass State, but moved to the greenest state in the land of the free as soon as he could. And it was here at the University of Tennessee where he completed his PhD in history. And we know that Dr. Hardy is a man of good sense because he stayed. He is now an East Tennessean, and it's even rumored that he wears the color orange throughout the year, save basketball season. After all, no man is perfect. What Dr. Hardy continues to perfect, though, is his understanding of the past. He and I first met when he was working here for the East Tennessee Historical Society in the education department. And he, alongside Lisa Oakley, who's with us today, worked tirelessly to build a network of teachers throughout the region who understood the power of local history in the classroom. They also worked tirelessly to create a network of students, both in high school and middle school, who were competing at the highest levels in the National History Day competitions. Despite that workload, Dr. Hardy was always generous with his time with me in the curatorial department. He proved to be an invaluable resource on projects dealing with Abraham Lincoln, the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, and most recently, the Jim Crow era in Knoxville. And it was really during this time that we first started talking about the origins of baseball and how to recreate it in Knoxville. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy that today. Today, Dr. Hardy serves as an assistant professor of history and the Lincoln Scholar at Lincoln Memorial University, where he's also the executive director of the Abraham Lincoln Center for Leadership and Public Policy. Outside of that, you should know that Dr. Hardy cares deeply for his family. He's an avid lover of the mountains. He's a founding member of the Knoxville Holstons Vintage Baseball Club, and he has a strong predilection for chocolate milk, donuts, and Olive Garden in no particular order. You should also know he's a dogged researcher, the type that understands the power of place and the importance of individual stories to larger events. And in that vein, his forthcoming title is on the Knoxville's $1 Million Fire, which will be an interesting publication, one that I've encouraged him to retitle as One Hot Night in Knoxville. But enough about the future. Our topic at hand is a perfect mania, the origins of baseball in Knoxville. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and good friend, Dr. William Hardy.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back at the East Tennessee History Center, where I spent 8 years here at the East Tennessee Historical Society, as Adam said, in the education department. And this topic for today really comes full circle in this building because it was approximately 10 years ago when I was working on the second floor when Adam walked into my office with a baseball in his hand, set it down on my desk, and had this little sly grin all over his face. So, what's this? He said, this is what we're going to be doing next summer. I was like, oh, this is interesting. And Adam pitched the idea that he was starting a vintage baseball club. He had seen two clubs playing over in the Nashville area. And I was pretty excited because I always wanted to play baseball. I just, for a number of reasons, unfortunately, just never had the opportunity to play any baseball as a young man. And so I was excited, and I said, this is great. I'll get to play baseball. And Adam said, well, not exactly. I said, what do you mean? And he said, I was thinking about, rather than playing baseball in your role, you would be what we call the arbiter in vintage baseball, the umpire. And I mean, all the excitement drained from my face. All the being able to live my childhood fantasies was gone in a heartbeat. And you know, no fault at Adam was right, and thought that'd be perfect to be the umpire, because in the vintage baseball game, their role is to explain the rules of the 1864 game that we play, and to also offer any context. And I can do that on the Civil War era. But I said, no, Adam, you're going to play baseball. I want to play baseball. Come on, Captain. Put me in. I'm ready to play. And there was 4 reasons I was excited to play vintage baseball. 1, obviously, getting to play baseball. Number 2, well, I needed the exercise badly. Number 3, it would be a great opportunity for my kids to see their old man play ball, and maybe occasionally not make a fool of himself and do something that looked like a bit of athletic prowess in the garden. And number 4, I knew instantly there was a possibility of publication opportunities. Being a Civil War scholar, I knew that there had been a wealth of knowledge on baseball, but the amateur game in the South, post-Civil War, even pre-Civil War, hadn't been thoroughly explored by historians. Now, I know that there are articles out there by baseball historians working with the Society, the SABR, the Society of Baseball, I'm going to butcher this, Mark? Society of American Baseball Research. Thank you, Dr. Feller. And I know that they've done some studies, but there's nothing been really extensive on post-Civil War baseball, and especially in Knoxville. I was excited to see, to dig into that story. And Adam had already done a little bit of brief history about the 2 teams that were going to be playing, the Knoxville Holstons, which was a team that existed in 1867, and the Drytown Boys of Harriman, Tennessee, which I believe existed a little bit later in the 1870s, if I recall correctly. So this was a really exciting opportunity to play the game and to do the research and hopefully produce something. It just took 10 years to do it. A lot on my plate. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Excited to share the product of that 10 years of research into baseball history. Now, first, I'm going to talk about the gentleman's game, the sort of amateur era baseball. And baseball was founded in the antebellum urban American environment and was constituted a sporting fraternity that emerged in mid-19th century America. It's middle to upper middle class culture, a culture that emphasized clean sport and exercise to improve one's health, character, and morality. The sport of baseball for these early amateur baseballists served as a vehicle to improve one's physical and spiritual well-being while providing masculine camaraderie, sociability, and entertainment. These early baseball clubs sought white gentlemen members, respectable young men of good position and good character, often those connected with various mercantile and banking houses, and a sprinkling of other professional occupations such as lawyers, doctors, real estate agents, etc., etc. Now, the game of baseball took many forms, but the game that becomes the national pastime about the time of the American Civil War was the New York game, which happened in Brooklyn, New York. And this game, born in really the mid-1850s, as rules were laid down and stipulations behind the game. Now, as several of these New York baseballists would eventually leave Gotham for new beginnings to the north, to the south, mostly to the west, they took the New York game with them and organized baseball clubs. And that's how this game became a national game in short order. If you look on this slide right here, before the American Civil War, baseball has spread across this continent and is out on the West Coast as early as 1858. But importantly, for what's coming, and I'll discuss, is that baseball existed in the South pre-Civil War. You can find it in Louisville, Kentucky. You can find it in Macon and Augusta, Georgia, Galveston and Houston, Texas, New Orleans. It was all across the South and in Memphis and Nashville, Tennessee. So it did exist before the 1860s. It was not, as often has been told, a sport that came to the South as a product of the American Civil War and appeared when Southern soldiers saw the game being played in their prison of war camps or elsewhere, maybe on the battlefield during a sort of a period in which there was no fighting, in which baseball was played. Now, baseball's growth was not halted by the American Civil War. It was only temporarily slowed. Yes, fewer games were played, and many baseballists joined the war, fighting for both Union and Confederate forces. But these baseballists turned soldiers continued to play the game in their camps, whether leisure and weather permitted, which helped spread the game to those who had never seen the game before. Soldiers played here at Fort Pulaski, Georgia. These are Union soldiers. This is usually regarded as the very first photograph of a baseball game. You can see the 48th New York Volunteer Infantry in the front, the band, but in the background, that is a baseball game being played back there. And as I mentioned a minute ago, Union soldiers would play baseball even in Confederate prison of war camps, as seen in this 1863 lithograph of a prison of war camp in Salisbury, North Carolina. Now, what the Civil War did was help democratize the game by exposing it to a blue-collar class, so to speak, of Americans who in the post-Civil War era would organize baseball clubs of their own as a source of not only entertainment and physical exercise, but also to maintain a masculine camaraderie that the soldiers were used to from 4 years of serving and fighting alongside each other. Now, after the war, baseball exploded. Americans caught the baseball fever with the tens of thousands. And this epidemic struck Americans from coast to coast with such ferocity that, in the words of the editor of the Daily National Intelligencer, it constituted a perfect mania of the masculine persuasion, irrespective of age, station, or condition, has an attack of the baseball fever. Which now brings us to Knoxville, Tennessee. And when did baseball arrive, and by whom? The origin stories of Knoxville baseball, until more recently, has often been attributed to one man, Samuel Billings Dow, as Knoxville's founding father of baseball. And it comes from an article that's been widely available to researchers and those interested in baseball's origins upstairs on the 3rd floor of the McClung Historical Collection in its vertical files. It was an article published on November 20th, 1921 in the Knoxville Sentinel. The Sentinel's associate editor and manager, M.B. Withers, penned this article in which he wrote, quote, "Baseball has quite changed a bit since the Civil War, but the games were just as interestingly and hotly contested back in 1865 as they are today in 1921. In those days, gloves were unknown, and overhand pitching was not allowed. Big scores were the rule, and it was no strange thing for one team to beat another by a comfortable margin of 30 runs. In these days, Babe Ruth is willing to call it a good day when he knocks a couple of home runs out of the Polo Grounds, but S.B. Dow, captain of the old Knoxville team, says that he always made 2 or 3 home runs in a game, end quote. S.B. Dow was Samuel Billings Dow, and he was already widely known, not just around Knoxville, but across America. He was not just one of the elder, at this time, merchant princes in Knoxville. He was nationally known as an expert sharpshooter, so much so that he featured on a poster by the United States Cartridge Company with other expert sharpshooters. And on the very bottom row in the dead center, you may notice a female, that is Annie Oakley. On the right side, you may already recognize Sam Dow was close friends with the world's wealthiest man, oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller. They were golfing buddies, and the Dow would often joke into the press that Rockefeller, he wins all the time, but he can't beat me. I can outrun him. I can outbeat him in a game of golf. That Rockefeller could only get 4 holes in before he was spent for the day. For those who know a little bit about Rockefeller, he suffered from ill health. Now, Dow was a larger-than-life personality. But this article from 1921, in which Dow tells the origins of Knoxville baseball, needs to be read very carefully. It is a collection of memories from an 82-year-old man who is purportedly recalling events that are from 55 years in the past. According to Dow, he started the first baseball club in Knoxville in 1865. And it was the first such baseball club in the South. He said that he had gotten the names of about 60 men, a mix of northern and southern boys, from the Civil War who were possible candidates to join his baseball club. And he set a date for a meeting at a local billiards room on Gay Street. Now, Knoxville, though situated in the heart of Unionist Civil War East Tennessee, it was a deeply divided city during the war. So therefore, there's going to be a good mix of Unionists and Confederates. Now, on the day of the meeting, Dow was surprised that only about half of the 60 men showed up. These were all Union men. They quickly organized their team, called the Knoxvilles. Elected their officers. Dow was elected captain. And they secured a field on the east side of Gay Street and began to practice. Meanwhile, according to Dow, those southern boys who didn't show up, they met elsewhere and organized their own club, called themselves the Holston Baseball Club. And they secured a field out along what is now Jackson Avenue, somewhere near the railroad tracks, to practice. Now, Dow goes on to mention some of the names of the baseballists, which are instrumental in getting a list of possible baseball players that played. But he goes back to say that the first baseball game, which shortly was played, happened in 1865, just right after the end of the American Civil War. In Dow's memory, this game was amazing, with several freak injuries in which he identifies unfortunate victims by name and how they came to incur those such injuries. Dow claimed that the Knoxvilles won that first match with the Holstons by 17 runs, and that they played a number of games over the years, about a few years, in which the Holstons won some, but the Knoxvilles basically won the most. He closed noting that he kept the team together for a few years until development on Long Gay Street made it necessary for us to abandon the old baseball grounds. Now, writing the history of the origins of baseball in Knoxville, means, as a historian, I can't rely on one source. I've got to go out and corroborate Dow's story. I've got to go out and find other evidence. Sure, I could be a journalist and use this, pull it out of the vertical files, and produce an article rather quickly. But as a historian, my name goes on to this publication, now in the Journal of East Tennessee History, which I'm very proud of. And I've got to be able to show my evidence for this story. And up till now, there have been few historians to even delve into this topic. And they must be acknowledged because as a good historian, we stand on the shoulders of those who come before us. And I must first say, a debt and honor is to the late Ron Allen, who was a local historian who did considerable research, I imagine, up on the third floor in the microfilm room, going through newspapers, and he compiled a list of books, a number of books on various topics on Knoxville history, and which is a wonderful vehicle into any certain topic, having go straight to the source and found where he found these accounts. He writes about Dow. It talks about this 1921 article, and he acknowledges, he says 1865, but I can't find anything in the newspapers, not till at least 1867. The second person I must acknowledge is Adam Alfrey, who, when he was doing his history of the first two baseball teams in our vintage baseball league on the Holstons and the Drytown Boys of Harriman, he produced his research and gave a presentation here in 2014, I believe, in the summer of 2014, in which he was the first to really push back on the 1865 date and say there's just no evidence for 1865. It's 1867, and here's the newspaper articles. And Adam was able to produce a variety of newspaper articles from 1867 with reports of these freak injuries that occurred during that so-called first baseball game that Dow mentioned. And they occurred over multiple games. The third person I must acknowledge is Mark Aubrey, who is a fascinating researcher. Actually, he's an unpaid researcher, I think. He often will send me messages at midnight for a project that should have been finished by now, the fire book that Adam mentioned. Mark has been one of these great friends that I have met through playing vintage baseball, and has been a source he's been a wonderful source to help me in my research. And he has produced, he has several blogs on Knoxville baseball history. I think it's called Ode Knoxville Baseball. He's done some groundbreaking work on African-American baseball, the Negro Leagues here in Knoxville, Appalachian Leagues, featured on WBIR recently, and produces research for Sabre. I stand on their shoulders and launched this project in which I had to go out and find a number of sources to be able to tell a much more complete story. Those sources include, well, the newspaper articles, thanks to like Ron Allen and who had found these articles, with box scores, which will produce names, often last names only. Adam found a listing of eligible bachelors in Knoxville in 1867. And under this list of bachelors, they give descriptions of them and list anyone who was playing baseball. These were baseball players. That gave me additional names, and in some cases, first names to last names. I could not tell who is this person. I mean, you get a name like a Smith, I've got a problem. How can I figure out who this Smith is? So those eligible bachelor ads were a help. Census records, city directories, to be able to figure out who these people were, their occupations, their net worth. Photographs, maps, to be able to discover where they played baseball. And as a tapophile, I love going to cemeteries. Cemetery visits have provided me additional information, like military rank that I did not know, and then I could add this is another baseball player who played in the military. Now, Samuel B. Dow. His article, for the most part, pretty good, but he exaggerates a little bit about his athletic prowess, and the dates are, as Adam correctly argued were a little bit off. And go figure, 1865, it begins in the spring of 1865. The Civil War is still going on. Knoxville is a disaster. This city, badly divided, fought over, occupied by both armies, maybe only unoccupied for a few days in 4 years of war. How could they be playing baseball? A lot of these names on this list weren't even here in 1865. One good thing came out of Adam's talk, well, many things, but while Adam spoke in 2014, a descendant of Dow came and attended the talk and had given him his information. And Adam mentioned in passing that this descendant had been there and he had given him his personal information and said he had some stuff. And so when I finally got the nudge from the journal editor to get this article done, I contacted Adam. He gave me the information, and I was like, wow, this has been like quite a number of years. I'll try this email. And lo and behold, I got a response within a few hours of sending that email and found him over in North Carolina. And he said, I've got some stuff in my basement. I said, I'll go. This is the COVID summer of 2020. I was ready to get out. I took precautions, but I went over to his house right off of Lake Norman. It's beautiful. And he took me down into his basement. That might be a little weird, but hey, cool things can be found in basements for historians. And when I went down, he had this workbench and cases, books, documents all across the desk, cases of stuff for two prominent Knoxville families. I'm working on him getting that collection to McClung. I'm trying. There is a wealth of information in there. But he told me, he said, look, I've got a lot of Sam Dow stuff here, but I've looked through it. I don't think I've got any baseball stuff, but you're happy to go through it. There was no baseball, nothing related to Dow and baseball, but there was a wealth of information which I can now tell a story about Dow and really get a good, solid, brief biography of this man. Sam Dow was born in Bangor, Maine in 1839. At a few years of age, his family migrated to Exeter, New Hampshire. I can't say for certain where Dow saw baseball played, but I can make some inferences. At the local academy in Exeter, the Phillips Exeter Academy, baseball was played. Even the President Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who attended there, played baseball. It's quite possible Dow saw baseball played there. Now, he probably didn't see the New York game there because up in New England, they favored the Massachusetts game, which was a game I'm glad we do not play in vintage baseball because one way to put you out was by soaking, and that is hitting you with a baseball base runner. You could hit a base runner and they'd be out. Thankfully, we do not have those rules. But it is quite possible he saw baseball there. One of the things this descendant had was a diary of Dow. It was before the baseball period and before the Civil War, but it was 1859 to 1860. And in that diary, I found that he had left Exeter in 1859, went to Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown. It was pretty cool. And he followed his brother to go into the grocery business, to learn the grocery trade. And in Louisville, Kentucky, baseball was very active. There was quite a number of teams. And gentlemen of his class were the gentlemen who played that game. I can't say for certain he played baseball there. He didn't say he played baseball before this period. But it's quite possible he saw baseball played in Louisville. The Civil War came, and Dow eagerly wanted to do his part and join the Union war effort. He was in Kentucky, which was neutral, so he crossed the Ohio River, made his way up to Indianapolis to see the governor of Indiana and asked, I will raise a regiment to do our part in Indiana, meeting the President Lincoln's quota to 75,000 troops to be raised across the country to put down the rebellion. The governor said, I thank you, Mr. Dow, but we've got enough troops. We've met the quota. Dow said, okay. He returned back to Louisville, Kentucky, and then soon thereafter joined the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry just across the Ohio River, actually in Jeffersonville, Indiana. That's where they formed the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry, not inside Kentucky's state border. His Civil War didn't last long. He was at the Battle of Shiloh. He caught illness so severely, he had to go back home to Exeter, New Hampshire to recover with his parents. Once he recovered, he got a desk job basically with the United States government and the Revenue Service. He found his way to Knoxville, Tennessee in 1864, shortly after Ambrose Burnside had liberated this city in the fall of 1863. It is there in Knoxville he laid down his roots, got into the grocery business, and he made fast friends in the masonry. And he gathered up a network of gentlemen just like himself. Now, we fast forward to 1867, a transformative event in Knoxville history, a transformative event along the entire East Tennessee River Valley, when the Holston River flooded. Now, we know it as the Tennessee River here today in Knoxville, Tennessee, but it was the Holston River at that time on down past Knoxville. That designation wasn't changed, I believe, in the General Assembly to the late 1890s or something like that, where it becomes the Tennessee River at the just north of the city. Here's an image of the flood of 1867. It was a flood that washed out many homes, flooded the city via its creeks, First and Second Creek, turning downtown Knoxville virtually into an island, which set up on a 60-foot bluff here, a little plateau, so to speak, if there is any flat ground in Knoxville. And business sort of kind of came to a standstill. And it was during this period, as the water slowly began to recede, that Dow started thinking about and talking to some of his friends about the idea of, let's play baseball. Let's organize a baseball club. And therefore, on March the 19th, 1867, Sam Dow called a meeting together at Joseph Cooper's Star Billiard Saloon. And this was an article that I'd found in the paper. It was very small print, easily to be overseen when someone is going through microfilm, looking at it with their eyes and getting a migraine as a result of looking at microfilm. I benefit from today's technology and being able to do an online search at home and use OCR to pop in baseball, and then found this, which I don't think anyone ever found. So this is the first notice published in the Knoxville Whig on March 20th that a baseball meeting had occurred the night before. Here's a photograph of downtown Knoxville. That is Sam Dow on the right at about approximately 1867. This image has always been published as 1869. Use the signs, use the city directories and newspapers, and you can find out that this picture is actually earlier than 1869. It's somewhere between the late summer of 1866 and the spring of 1867. So we're right in that period of baseball being organized. And if you see the red arrow, it's pointing at Star Billiards, which was located in Ramsey Hall, just underneath Slyer's, photographer T.M. Slyer's gallery. It was here, that night, that Dow organized that meeting, and it was, just as Dow had said, approximately mostly northern men who had shown up, Union soldiers. Now, in this meeting, Dow will organize it, and again, Dow on the right, he will be elected the captain of this club. The gentleman on the far left is Spencer Munson, and there he is in his Union uniform. Spencer Munson was from Mentor, Ohio, and for a brief period of time later in his life, his next-door neighbor was an Ohio congressman by the name of James Garfield, future president of the United States. If we move over to the right, the second from the top left, that is William Chamberlain, William Bill Chamberlain as he was known. He served in the 23rd Ohio, and he served under the command of two future United States presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley. He's also known as being he was a druggist part of the firm of Sanford, Albert, and Chamberlain's, or maybe I got that backwards how the firm went, but Sanford, Albers, and Chamberlain's drug firm. The gentleman to his right, third from the left, is Homer Charles Squire, who also was a Union officer and in the Revenue Service, which Dow worked in the Revenue Service, close friend, Mason. All these connections through the Masonry, through the Union Army, through their professional occupation class, these gentlemen. Lower left, that is Luther Stephen Trowbridge, a brigadier general in the United States Army, the highest ranking officer among any of the baseballists, but there's a common theme. These are officers. Squire was a sergeant. Munson was a sergeant. Chamberlain was a first lieutenant. I'll skip over to the gentleman on the third from the left. That is E.C. Camp, who also served in the Union Army, owned the Greystone Mansion, the home of WATE today, was a member in the Grant administration. Another connection, Republicans. All of these Unionists who were Republicans, highly supportive, unconditional Unionists, I should go ahead and say, who supported Abraham Lincoln's policies, not just preservation of the Union, but also emancipation. The outlier in this group is a gentleman on the far right, on the bottom, underneath Dow. That is John W. Paxton, who was a Mason and the lone Confederate on this team. He was the captain of the 19th Tennessee, the Paxton Grays, as they were known. And sort of when Dow says this is a clear distinction between Union and Confederates, he sort of neglects one of his closest friends here, who is a Confederate. But for the most part, these are Union soldiers. Unconditional Unionists will be the future Republican leaders of Knoxville, Tennessee. They chose a baseball ground. Now, this, Dow would say in his 1921 article, this was at that time the present location of Woodruff's store on Gay Street, what is today the 400th block of Gay Street. Finding a vacant land in Knoxville was tough. In the business district, the only area left was today's 400th and 300 blocks of Gay Street. The problem was the land was a dump. Knoxvillians dumped their trash there. It was overgrown, had Jimson weeds and everything on this area, and the McClungs owned it. And the McClungs were eager to sell it to begin further development, and the city would march forward its business district further north to the railroad. And Dow and his close friend Charles Seymour, a lawyer, real estate agent, and close personal friend of the McClungs, went to the McClung family, the Charles McClung and Frank McClung, the two eldest in this family, and they were the grandchildren of Charles McClung, who basically laid out Knoxville, Tennessee, and hence they got a lot of land as a result of that. When they laid out the city in 1791, they got their blessing to play baseball, that they would clear that land for a baseball ground to play. But the McClungs made one condition. They said, when we're ready to sell this, we're gonna sell this property, and you'll have to find somewhere else. That's fine. And so Dow's and Knoxville's went quickly together to clear this land and prepare it for baseball. What about the other gentlemen, the so-called Southern gentlemen that Dow mentioned who didn't show up? There was a group of men who did not show up, who didn't want to play with Dow's Knoxville's team. These men organized their own baseball club, called themselves the Holston Baseball Club. I gather they got the name possibly thinking about the flood that had just recently happened of the Holston River. That's just my inference there. And they put together a club. Now, they chose as their captain Robert Armstrong, and his brother Frank Armstrong played. And what's interesting about this team is, whereas the Knoxvilles are mostly Union men, mostly from the north, gentlemen who had come into the city at the end of the American Civil War. I should go ahead and say, not carpetbaggers. that mythology of the lost cause, of carpetbagging Northern Yankees coming in, exploiting the natural resources of the South. Here in Knoxville, they were welcomed. You know, they looked fondly on Knoxville. They had served here. If you read their letters, they talk about East Tennessee being the most beautiful land they've ever seen, and East Tennessee women being the most beautiful women on God's green earth. And they came here, eager, invited to come here, married those Southern daughters. They were welcome because they had the energy and vision of a new South they wanted to build. And yes, that meant to tap into unnatural resources. And they wanted to diversify the South's economy, not just be an agricultural base, to help East Tennessee and Tennessee grow and progress. They don't fit the carpetbagging mythology, the myth, because one thing they did recognize, a smart thing was marrying Southern daughters here, but also they didn't bring a radical social agenda. They did support emancipation, but these were more moderate Republicans who didn't necessarily advocate for greater civil and political rights for African Americans. Having done that, they were suitable stock to stay. Now, there were some radical Republicans who showed up here who got driven out real quick in Knoxville, Tennessee. But back to the Holstons. Were these Southern soldiers? They weren't really Southern soldiers. They came from Southern sympathizing families on part. These were very young men, on average about 22 years of age. One player, 14. The Knoxvilles were an older group, about 25 and a half on average. The Holstons were a mix. They had 2 Union veterans and 2 Confederate veterans. And one of those Union veterans was basically a medical cadet. He didn't see any action. And one of the Confederate veterans was a courier who passed messages. These were young men who were too young to fight. What I found in my research, what connected them was politics. Like the Knoxvilles were Republicans, these are Democrats in the post-Civil War period. They were a mix of Southern sympathizers who sympathized with the Confederate Army and Confederacy during the Civil War, but there was also a bunch of Unionists, conditional Unionists, from families like as old as the Williams. The gentleman in the upper right photograph, that is J.C. Williams, who comes from the John Williams family. His dad was a close friend of President Andrew Johnson. Now, these gentlemen were Unionist supporters at the beginning of the Civil War. They supported Lincoln's preservation of the Union, but the moment emancipation got on the table, they were done. They didn't sign up for any social change. And so at the end of the Civil War, these conditional Unionists gravitated to the point that they were breaking bread with their initial former enemies, these rebels or Southern sympathizers. These become Democrats. John C. Williams here is a prominent lawyer, defended the coal miners in the coal mine wars, and played a prominent role in a couple of Democratic administrations, presidential administrations. Gentleman on the bottom is Colonel William Caswell with his 2-year-old pony there, 2-month-old pony there. William Caswell was a very wealthy gentleman. He was a Confederate courier during the American. He's the Confederate courier that I mentioned. Gentleman in the upper left, that's Samuel Bell Luttrell. He was the mayor's son, James Churchill Luttrell, the mayor of Knoxville during the American Civil War. This was his son. He was a Union captain during the American Civil War. But when he came back in the post-Civil War period, the policies, more radical policies in state government from William Parson Brownlow, drove Luttrell to the Democratic Party. By the mention, his brother, who also played James C. Luttrell Jr., he was a Confederate officer during the American Civil War. So politics is what brings these together. So where Dow says these are Union Confederate men, it's not so much that, it's the post-war politics that united them. Knoxvilles being the Republicans and the Holstons being the Democrats. Where did these players play? We've long known about Dow's Knoxville's playing on the Gay Street baseball grounds. This was sort of path-breaking in this research. There had been mention that they played along where Jackson Avenue now is around the railroads. Now, I can't say for certain exactly where the Holstons played, but there was an 1895 article that I found that mentioned Cripple Creek. That is First Creek. Cripple Creek gets its name according to, I believe I saw an article from Lucy Templeton many, many moons ago, who said it had to do with the bend in the creek. It's why they called it Cripple Creek. It was an area prone to flooding, and it had flooded significantly. And looking at the maps at this period of 1867, and looking at the maps trying to find vacant land, the best guess I can get is where I've sort of placed that sort of burgundy-looking baseball in a vacant area. And First Creek has changed its path since then, since this 1867 map. But what's interesting is where they played. It is quite possible they played on the very ground where Randy Boyd today is building the Smokies, I guess will be the Knicks Smokies Stadium. That is an interesting connection of Knoxville's baseball past, bringing it back into the urban environment and linking it with baseball today. So that was an interesting find. Now, again, I can't say exactly there, but they say it's along the creek, so they will be possibly playing baseball on the very ground that the Knoxville Holstons played baseball in 1867. Now, to wrap this up, I'm going to talk about some baseball, some of the stories of the early baseball games. We know that the first baseball game, based on newspaper, what's available research, is May the 4th, 1867. Reported here on May 8th, 1867 in the Knoxville Whig. Now, these early games, we get just little snidbits. They're through the Knoxville Whig. This is Parson Brownlow's paper. He's more interested in political affairs. Baseball's a novelty. This is interesting. And my gosh, who are these guys who want to be idle and lazy on the weekends when they should be in church playing baseball? And so there's little information, but what we do get is during that first game in 1867, it was attended by hundreds of spectators, both men and women. And women play a part as spectators in this game. And it was believed by women being on the ball field that they would calm the men and that they would not get out of hand, not get overly competitive, and remember that they are gentlemen first and foremost. During that game, a brass band led the procession of these two teams, the Knoxville Knoxvilles and the Holstons, to the Knoxville baseball grounds. And it is said by Dow that they won that first game by 17. I can't confirm it from another source, but it does hold true that the Knoxvilles prevailed in that first game. An immediate challenge was issued the next week for a game, and that game the Holstons won in the second match. Now, what I have found through the records, only 4 games that the Holstons and the Knoxvilles played. And Dow said they won most. The Holstons won some. My research shows the Knoxvilles won just that first game. The Holstons got better and better with each game and stomped the Knoxvilles in the city championship in November 1867 by a score of 90-25. I'm sure of those 25, Dow got 2 or 3 home runs. Those injuries. Such a lovely game, baseball. Lots of injuries, a lot of freak injuries. Our friend on the left, Spencer Munson, neighbor of James Garfield. He was playing in the outfield when a ball was hit deep. He caught it. Lovely catch. And as he was going to throw the ball into the infield, people heard a bone snap. His elbow dislocated. I think Adam playing vintage baseball, I can maybe offer an explanation. They weren't good on calisthenics and stretching and everything before a game. I can see how such freak injuries may have occurred, especially after having broken an arm and having a rotator cuff surgery a couple years ago. I know my arm needs a lot of warm-up before a game these days. The 2 figures in the center and the right, William Chamberlain and Samuel Bell Luttrell. In another game, Bill Chamberlain for the Knoxvilles steps up to the plate, hits a massive shot out to the outfield. Samuel Bell Luttrell, the mayor's son, gets under it. He's ready to catch it, loses it in the sun. I can also attest to this happening. And the ball just went right into his forehead, and he dropped like a beef on the ground, unconscious, and had to be carried from the field. I've seen baseballs temporarily tattoo foreheads, right, Adam? Adam, when he was practicing vintage baseball before forming our team, went over to Nashville or went over to Harriman, Roane State Community College, and was in a game. I think he was pitching, and the ball was delivered back right into his forehead. He showed up on a Monday morning staff meeting with it tattooed to his forehead still. There were these freak injuries that occurred during 1867, during these early games. I do want to tell, those Holstons got better with each game. And I can attest to that as our vintage baseball team, because I think we lost our first 5 games until we really got our pace in that first season, and then we went on a tear. The Holstons got better with each game. They limited their opponents to less runs with each game. And they quickly became regarded as a powerhouse across the state. In the summer into the fall of 1867, the Holstons were challenged by the state champions of 1866, the Mountain City Club of Chattanooga. Now, let me say a quick word about championships. These were best of 3 series, and they could be called any moment 2 teams agreed. So, although usually regarded as the 2 better teams in the area, but the Holstons were challenged by Mountain City because they'd sort of sensed these Holstons were probably the next best team in the state. They played a best of 3 series, and the Knoxville Holstons won in the 3rd and final game to claim the series to be the state champions. And Brownlow's Knoxville Whig gave them 3 cheers and a tiger for the Holston in the paper. The Holstons went on to defeat, as I mentioned, in that 90-25 game, the Knoxvilles for the city championship. And the Holstons were riding high in 1867. And then they got too big for their trousers, and they sent a challenge to the Gates City Club of Atlanta. Also a gentleman club, much like these amateur-era baseball teams, undefeated, a traveling team. I call them the forerunners of the Cincinnati Red Stockings. Although the Cincinnati Red Stockings become professional, these are sort of that last hurrah of amateur great teams. And the Gate City Club said, we'll come up to Knoxville to play you guys. Thanksgiving Day. Newspaper man Colonel John Fleming, a baseball booster. Newspapers are very important for boosting the game. Said the reputation of the city is at stake. On Thanksgiving Day, this game's going to play, and we expect a game, exciting game. We are not saying the proper way to pay respects to the national holiday is to play baseball, but if the boys think so, let them thus give thanks. This game was a fiercely fought contest, back and forth, inning to inning. Reports are betting was occurring during the game, showing this game was evolving rather quickly in Knoxville to adopt some more unseemly characteristics of the game that was developing elsewhere across the nation. In the last inning, the Holstons had the Gate City. They just had to hold them off for the bottom of the 9th. And the Gate City Club went on a run and won the game. What happened next is a source of contention between the people of Knoxville, Tennessee, and Atlanta, Georgia. In Knoxville, Tennessee, they reported it was a wonderful affair after the game. A huge banquet was put on by Knoxville. Judge Baxter's daughter, Julia Baxter, made a beautiful cake for the Gate City Club, and they were happy with the festivities. And big events like this were part of the after party for these games, where these gentlemen came together and drank alcohol and had a lot of great desserts, they would report. Knoxville says it was a wonderful event, and the Gate City Club went on happy. But a few days later in Atlanta, one of the Gate City Club members publicly denounced the Knoxville Holstons as unseemly gentlemen who were bruised and battered after this game and hurt feelings, and that they had insulted them during this festivity. Knoxville, there's an exchange back and forth between the captains of these two clubs, and either side agreed to disagree on what happened. In 1868, the Holstons began their title defense rather late. In fact, the club had just sort of gone on for the winter and went to their occupations, and John Fleming keeps writing in the paper, when the Holstons going to organize? Y'all are the defending champions. Finally, in the late summer of 1868, they get a challenge from a Nashville baseball club. And the Holstons are like, now we're going to get together, get serious about baseball. And they start playing some scrimmages against boys, teenage boys, even some boys under the age of 13 in the streets of Knoxville on the Holston ground as well, showing that baseball had democratized. Quickly, people of all ages were playing, and white and black. There was already 3 black baseball teams in this area. But in these matches, the young boys beat the Holstons bad. And John Fleming was livid. He wrote in one of these, after this, the Holstons had better hang their bats on a willow tree, and if they feel that they must have exercise, they could probably find some kind-hearted farmer who will give them a job at husking corn and pay them with the shucks, which will be more than their services are worth. If they are no better than that at playing ball, we will let them advertise for a job at half price. We will also like to help the afflicted, downtrodden, and oppressed when our power to do so. Fleming could be biting in his language, and he took shots at Sam Dowell's Knoxvilles all the time in the paper. The Holstons finally got their act together and played the Nashville club in the 1868 state championship. But in the best of 3, the Holstons were defeated by the Nashville club. And shortly after that, the Holston Club disbanded. There are reports of another Holston Club in the 1870s playing, but it's not the same team anymore. This team disbanded. The Knoxvilles stayed together for one more year. One last game on the Gay Street baseball grounds in 1869. Told by Herbert Hall, recollecting on this event, this 1869 game, it was the bottom of the 9th. The Knoxvilles were down by 1 run to their rival, the Greenville City College Club. Runner was on first. The tying run, Sam Dowell comes to the plate. The pitcher throws the first 3 pitches to the wide of the plate. Dowell is convinced, this guy is intimidated by me. He's going to throw it wide again. I'm going to step into the box and I'm going to get that ball. And on that pitch, it was low, but Dowell got the end of his bat on it. And wouldn't you know? Home run. He reported that ball rolled all the way down almost to the railroad tracks. It's a long ball. But by the time they got the ball back in, Dowell had circled the bases and won the game. And that would be one of the last matches played on the Gay Street baseball grounds. Because shortly thereafter, offers were being made and the McClungs were selling lots on that property. Over in the far left, you can see the first few buildings being built on what was the Gay Street baseball grounds. And that building on the very edge, the kind of third building from the far left, was the Sanford, Chamberlain, and Albers drugstore. To put a twist on the Joni Mitchell 1970 hit song, they paved paradise and put up a bunch of 3- and 4-story brick warehouses. Thank you.
If there are questions, you can come up to the microphone and ask your questions.
Nice shirt.
Thank you. I thought it was appropriate for the occasion.
Indeed.
So, as one researcher to another, good job. I'm wondering if you've run into a pitcher by the name of Rufus Oliver Moore. He was playing a little bit later, probably the 1880s, 1890s.
The question is, have I run into a pitcher, Rufus Oliver Moore?
Went by Ollie or All?
Went by either Ollie or Al. Pitching in maybe the 80s?
1880s and 90s.
In 1880s and 90s. I have not. Now, I have limited myself to the 1860s with these 2 baseball teams and what was going on at the time. However, there's another publication out there to really tell this story of Knoxville and tell a story which is fills in what's going on with Civil War baseball in the South. And there could be, I could come across it, but I have not. I have not come across that player. I could throw it to the crowd and look to my good friend, researcher Mark Aubrey. Have you heard that name?
No, but I'm looking.
He is looking. And that is why he is such a dependable
Well,
friend.
I'm trying to track him down because he is the grandfather of the individual I think is probably the greatest baseball player to come from Knoxville, Tennessee. Doris Sammy Sams, who played 8 years with the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. 6-time All-Star, 2-time MVP.
Excellent.
Oh, and set the single season record for home runs at 12. Not particularly impressive to our contemporary times, favorably compared to both Ted Williams and Babe Ruth. Yeah, she was a pitcher first. When she quit pitching, she started hitting over 300 and hitting home runs.
Wow.
So I'm a longtime Knoxville person. I have heard about the ball field at Woodruff's on the east side of Gay Street. I am just skeptical that there is enough level space there that they could play that game. So will you tell us about the size of the field they were playing on at that time?
That field, the question was about the skepticism of the Gay Street baseball grounds and the level of the field, because anybody knows in Knoxville, and I joke, there is no level ground here. It falls off significantly as you go down towards State Street and Central, and then towards what is First Creek. It did create a natural amphitheater feeling for spectators, and that was mentioned in articles. I suspect maybe that's how Sam Dowell could get some home runs in these big scores, so the ball would just roll on forever. Which makes sometimes playing on vintage baseball grounds, on uneven ground, a lot of fun with the bounces the balls will take. But looking at maps, looking at newspaper articles, well into the late 19th century, stores that say opposite of the baseball grounds, you find those stores on the west side of the 400 block and 300 block of Gay Street. So there's a lot of corroborating sources that puts it right there in that spot. And looking at bird's eye map of 1871 in Knoxville, which is available in the museum shop, is you can see that there is starting to be some buildings and some houses. But all that developed post 1871 when they started laying the street all the way up to what was Mabry Street, which would be about generally, I guess, close to where Summit is now or thereabouts. Yeah. So that ground was open. Now, there is an interesting newspaper article in the summer of 1867 where Joseph Cooper Star Billiards, which was the meeting site of the Knoxvilles and became a hangout for both clubs when they had their meetings, he offered a special cigar box. And I think Adam and I had conversations about this. We'd love to find this cigar box. This cigar box had an image on the top of a baseball game. And supposedly, it shows a home run being hit over a Shropshire, I'm going to forget his first name right now, Shropshire's house, which was located on the Gay Street baseball grounds. So apparently, at some point, his house was located within the ability of a baseball home run to go over the roof. And on the box, the mayor of Knoxville, James Churchill Luttrell, was featured. I don't know if he was the one that was hitting the home run or not, but there's just a lot of corroborating sources that's where they played.
I'm not doubting the Woodruff location. What I'm curious about, 90-foot base pads or 30-foot base pads? I mean, it had to be a smaller field than we're playing on today. What field do you guys play on?
Well, they were playing on 90 feet.
They were 90 feet at that point?
Yeah. Now, the question is, he said home plate was put at where Woodruff's was located. If that's exact, we don't know exactly, but that lot is, the sources will point to it, that they played there. But yeah, they played 90 feet base pass. The pitcher was 60 feet. It was 45 feet or so from the home plate, but the dimensions are there.
Yeah, so pitcher's a little closer than today.
Oh yeah, a little bit closer. Yeah. Adam can attest to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can attest too. I mean, I played pitcher in our last game, and I think about 6 balls ended up pelting me, but I put my body on the line to stop the ball.
Yes, got a question for you. Let me preface my question first by telling about a project we're doing to honor integrated baseball game played on Sutherland Field back in the 30s and 40s. If you go down to Emma's Southern Kitchen Restaurant, you can see some banners we put up. In your research, was there an opportunity for any black athletes to play in those games at that time?
A very great question, and this is in my article. The question is, in any of these early games, was there any opportunities for African American baseballists to play? They appealed to play. There was at least 3 teams in the area, and in the 1867 city championship, played in November of 1867, they appealed to play, and they were rejected. So the game that these gentlemen played was a very segregated game. Yeah, among these gentlemen.
What my research has found, it brought the Pond Gap neighborhood together. It was common on a Sunday afternoon to see black and white families share at a picnic lunch and watch very diverse games being played and everything. But I appreciate your efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Just to comment on the existence of black clubs, there were black clubs, at least in the 1870s going forward, playing in Knoxville. I don't know if you've run into them. There was one club that I know we're still trying to figure out who they were and where they were playing. Their manager player was Joseph A. Mabry, a colored man, not the man from the Hazen House. But I know Patrick's been trying to track him down for some time. They were playing as early as 1871.
Yeah, and to mention there about African American teams playing in the 1870s and Mabry, and one of the images I had up here I didn't mention, Asa Hazen, attributed to that family, was a very star player for the Holstons. But I will say this: one thing I want to add about women. Women are playing baseball at this time as well. But the first report that I have found, and I've done a little bit digging outside of the 1860s, is there was an article in 1884 where a women's baseball club wanted to come to Knoxville, and they were asking, would there be anybody to play us? And unfortunately, no one would agree to play them. But, it just is, I cannot figure out where they were located. The article doesn't say if they were a Tennessee team. I would love to know that information. But that women also were actively playing baseball.
Someone online asked about where they could experience a vintage baseball game if they wanted to see one.
The question is, where can someone experience a vintage baseball game? We play as part of the Tennessee Association of Vintage Baseball. And as members of the Knoxville Holston Club, and there is another team, the Emmett Machinists, who were a team that also played in 1867, which further democratizes the game because these were machinists and laborers that worked along the railroad lines that played the Holstons. In 1867 on July 4th, Independence Day. You can watch these games out at the Historic Ramsey House. One of the things about Tennessee Association of Baseball is when education is an important core part of our mission, and important part is playing at historic sites. And for us, we've had the benefit of playing the Historic Ramsey House. Usually play out there on Saturdays about 10 or so times a year, and you can find that information at the Tennessee Association of Vintage Baseball's website and going on the Historic Ramsey House as well. All right. Thank you all so much for attending this day.